In some of my previous presentations, I discussed the definition of critical thinking and the importance of critical thinking for students and teachers. In the current presentation, I would like to discuss critical thinking and its relationship with the process of education. Critical thinking is a process that is deep, rational, objective, independent, multifaceted, and inquisitive thinking. So as we can see that every one of us actually thinks. What is critical thinking that it makes different from general thinking? The thing that makes this particular type of thinking different from general thinking is that it is a deeper form of thinking, it is a more general form of thinking, it is objective, generally independent, multifaceted, and inquisitive, and so there is the process of questioning involved, and most importantly, critical thinking is generally deliberate thinking. So there is some intention behind this thinking, some aims and objectives. The process of education, on the other hand, is basically the process of obtaining and developing knowledge, skills, and dispositions. And so we can see that it again is a deliberate process, and in a realistic type of educational process, we need to actually employ the kind of characteristics of thinking that we just discussed with reference to critical thinking. Now, how is it that the process of critical thinking play its role in the process and outcomes of the process of education? This is what we will see in the rest of this presentation. So, critical thinking is associated with the process of education. Firstly, because critical thinking helps us in thinking about the aims of education. So, what are the aims of education? What knowledge, skills, dispositions do we need through the process of education? And why is it that that particular aim or those particular aims are associated with the process of education? So the first thing that critical thinking helps us is actually thinking about the aims of education. Secondly, what are the contents of education and why are those contents included in the process of education? In other words, once we think about the aims of education, the next thing that we need to think about is actually to think about and to question the contents of education. So first of all, what should that content be? Secondly, why should we have that content, and whether that the contents of education is actually in line with the aims of education that we have already set for it. The third way in which critical thinking helps us is actually thinking critically and questioning about the processes and means of education. So, what processes are involved in actually the imparting of the process of education, and or what means are employed in order for the educational process to be productive? So these are the questions that we need to think. The other question in terms of the processes of education is actually to ask whether the process of education that is currently in place is in line with the aims of education. Is it productive and is it suitable for imparting the contents in line with the aims and objectives of education. The next important aspect of education is the evaluation processes. So the educational process needs to be evaluated as a whole, both in terms of its process and outcomes. So critical thinking will help us in analyzing the whole educational process and the outcomes. The other thing, most important thing, is that critical thinking helps us in analyzing, in questioning the role, responsibilities, and the parts of important educational stakeholders, such as students. So, what is the role of the students, teachers? What are the roles and responsibility, and also the dispositions and skills needed on the part of teachers? What is the role and responsibilities of parents? What are the roles and responsibilities of educationists and the curriculum planners and policymakers, society leaders, and on a larger scale, the government? So, what critical thinking actually helps us is to establish the role of these important stakeholders and to establish the place of responsibility of these important stakeholders, and actually to highlight the problems that might come as a result of the roles of the way these important stakeholders play their roles and responsibilities in the process of education. And the last one is that the critical thinking actually helps us in understanding the process of evolution in education, the development of education, and the direction of the educational process. So, to summarize, we can see that critical thinking is very important in terms of understanding the aims of education, the contents of education, the processes of education, the evaluation of education. It helps us in understanding the roles and responsibilities of educational stakeholders, and it helps us in terms of understanding the way the process of education has evolved, and also in terms of understanding the current and the future direction of the educational process.